Hello everyone, I am Professor Paul Carrier at Western Michigan University, Thomas M. Cooley Law School, and today what I'd like to do is provide some prequel or some thoughts to consider as you're doing the homework for Class 3 of Contracts 1. As you might remember, last week we were talking about the acceptance, and we are still in the area of acceptance, but we are going to be considering a few different topics this week. The first one is when an offer is actually terminated. Is there a point where the offer disappears such that it's no longer on the table for the offeree to accept? And there are certain ways by which the offer ends, so that you either say that the offer closes or the power of acceptance terminates. That's two sides of one coin. You could use either form of terminology. So we'll talk about several ways that offers terminate, taking away the power of acceptance. We will also learn a few rules that cover situations where an offer has to stay open for a certain period of time. And for example, we call it an option contract generally. Someone makes an offer and promises the other side that the offer will stay open for 1 week while the other side tries to get the financing together. And then the item to be sold or the deal to be had won't change for at least that week. That takes the offeror's power of termination away for that period of time, and there are several ways that these options, these time periods where an offer is not revocable, are established. We will talk at least a little bit at the end of today's material about another non-rejection. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but as a segue into the following week, Class 4's material, I might mention a few rules about UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, 2-207, which is called the Battle of the Forms. More about that later. Okay, basic ways to revoke the power of acceptance. If you wanted to write down a list in your outline, perhaps the best source would be Restatement Second of Contracts, Section 36, which is in fact on page 77 of your materials. And so you can take it there and perhaps write bullet points. First, if the offeree says no, I refuse, I can't buy it, I don't want it, thank you, but no. Another way which is similar is a counteroffer. I like it, but I can't pay more than $5,000, not $6,000. That is a rejection because it's not accepting the offeror's deal. And then what it actually does is, in rejection, it's a counteroffer. It flip-flops the parties. And so the offeror's offer is rejected by a counteroffer. And then the counteroffer becomes the new offer, which turns the former offeror into the offeree, who then does have the power of acceptance under rules that we've already discussed. A second way to revoke the power of acceptance, in other words, to stop the effective time period of an offer, is by lapse of time. And if lapse of time is stated, this offer is open for 10 days, it's over after 10 days. Also, if it's not stated, an offer, it will lapse, it will end after a reasonable time. Offers do not stay open ad infinitum. I offer to sell you my motorcycle, you can't come back 10 years from now and accept it. And so if there's not a time period stated, lapse of time will work. Revocation. The offeror could step up and say to an offeree before acceptance, and if it's not locked in or bound by some kind of option, the offeror can say, sorry, I have to take the deal back. It's no longer on the table. And if that's properly communicated in time, then the offeree does not have the ability to accept. Okay, one of the problems in contracts law in this particular area, remember we're in Contracts 1, formation, not offer, but now the acceptance. One of the big problems is where the timing is different on when an offeree says I accept and when an offeror says you have no longer any time to accept, it's revoked. And when you see problems in communication and timing, you see topics that are ripe, in fact, for multiple choice questions more than anything. The death or incapacity of either the offeror or the offeree terminates an offer. So if I, for example, offer to sell you my motorcycle and you see the offer and you're thinking about it for a day or two, it would lay open until reasonable time, or I gave a time frame, or I revoked it, or I died. If I died 2 days after the offer was made, then upon my death, that offer would have been revoked by operation of law because of my death. If you died as offeree, hopefully not, but as an example, as well, the offer would have been revoked, which is a bit different because if you have a formed contract, offer, acceptance, consideration, and mutuality formed, and then someone dies, that contract still stays in place. So the offeror on the death of, the offer on death of offeror or offeree, gone, revoked, terminated. Power of acceptance terminated, it's done. Contract still in place. And it might help you remember the reason why, or at least a factual scenario that explains it. When you are dead, you will have hopefully a will, but there will be an estate. And there's an executor of that estate who closes down your obligations and then distributes monies or property to the recipients of your goodwill, your bequests, for example. And those remain in place until the law shuts down your estate. Even though you're already dead, your legal obligations that are already formed remain, okay? And that's different between an offer and acceptance. Death revokes the offer. Death does not remove the contractual obligation. That could be done later by operation of law, pursuant to the rules on estates, wills, estates, and trusts. Okay, probate, basically. Keep in mind, again, death or incapacity. If someone goes insane, then the offer is revoked as well. Very briefly, a few case highlights. In Dickinson versus Dodds, we have an old case that deals with a unilateral contract. It does not ask for a return promise. This is unilateral, not bilateral. It wants performance only. I will sell you the land if you hand me the cash by Friday. Okay? I don't want to promise that you'll pay. You must hand me the cash. Well, the offeree learned from a reliable source that the property the day before Friday had already been sold. And so the offeror didn't stop the offeree, shake his hand, and tell him that the offer was revoked. But the information received by the offeree was treated as just as good. The offeree had credible information that the deal was no longer on the table and the offer was revoked based on information from his own agent that the land was already sold. And keep in mind, the offeror did not promise the offeree he'd leave it open until Friday only for the offeree. He said, if you pay me by Friday, you have the land. That implies he has the right to sell it to other people as well, okay? Because he did not have an exclusive deal with the offeree. Therefore, credible information to the offeree that the property was sold revoked the offer. It terminated the offeree's power of acceptance. Pedersen versus Patberg is similar. Another agreement where performance was expected. You owe me money. My offer is if you pay me soon, by this date, I will have you pay less. Well, as the offeree comes to pay less, the offeror sees him through a screen door and says, don't hand me the money, don't say a word, the deal's off. And that as well was held as a revocation. The offeree did not yet have the time to properly tender his performance of payment before the offeror revoked it. And that's another old case. I understand that to some of you that does not seem fair. If it's revoked before you get the money ready, that makes sense. If it's revoked as you're about to hand it to somebody, that doesn't seem fair. There are some rules that we'll talk about a little bit that help to cover the worst of those fact situations where it just isn't fair. Okay? The case that follows is Marciando versus Scheck, and that is a new rule that I've just alluded to a minute ago, where sometimes the cases are just unfair. What happens is, in many jurisdictions, and now this is verified, it is legitimized in the UCC and certainly in the Restatement Second on Contracts as a valid aspect of the common law. Now, if someone significantly begins performance, right, then the law will create, by operation of law, an option contract, which will allow the performing offeree reasonable time in which to finish his or her performance in a unilateral contract. Perhaps an example is best. If you paint my garage, I will give you $3,000. If you go and buy 2 paintbrushes, you have not done enough yet to lock in this bargain. What if you go and buy paintbrushes, you go and buy special paint, you show up to my garage, and you start scraping it down for a day, and I come out the next morning and throw you off the job, you having already expended a certain amount of money, a certain amount of preparation. It's just not fair that I don't pay you anything because you did not fully perform. And so what the law will do in those cases, and you'll see this discussed on pages 91 and 92 of the materials, it will, once you meaningfully begin performance in your unilateral contract, it will lock in your time to finish. It will give you a reasonable time to finish such that you can try to finish and then be paid. And I can't walk out in the middle of it and revoke in mid-performance and not pay you anything. There is another way to handle that as well, which we will probably talk about when we talk about remedies at the end of Contracts 1. The Loring case, there was an offer of a reward, and the reward was claimed 3 or 4 years after it was made. And so that's a case where even when the time to perform is not stated, an offer will still lapse after a reasonable time. And after 3 or 4 years, that is more than long enough. And so you can't come back decades later to accept a reward, for example. And so the offer had been revoked by lapse of reasonable time where it was otherwise not stated. Phillips versus Moore, what we learned there is, remember we talked about the common law. In the old days, the offer would look like this, and the acceptance had to look just like it with no differences. If there was a difference, that was a rejection counteroffer. If it was the same, it was an acceptance. Well, that was an old rule that the modern trend that law today doesn't really appreciate. There should be the ability to have a few small differences, just some small ones. And if that's the case, why not allow these parties still to have a bargain and fix the few things where there may be minor disagreement or minor misunderstanding? If it's a major misunderstanding, don't find a contract. But if it's minor, we should probably still honor the contract, enforce it, and just interpret or add or gap fill, we'll learn about that term a little bit later, so the terms to make sure that the bargain is fully supplemented or complemented, okay? And the Phillips versus Moore case explains that an acceptance that is just a little bit different is not always a rejection, okay? Your materials cover as well in this area, in this particular class period, the concepts of death incapacity, which I talked about earlier, also outright rejection, where the offeree says, no, I don't want the deal, never in a million years. There are no cases on that. Nevertheless, it's so simple, we don't really need cases on that. It's the harder areas, the more questionable fact situations, where we need to explain and provide case materials. Finally, the last case, Morrison versus, I think it's Thelke. If the offeror, who is the master of his or her offer, defines exactly how acceptance must be made, then the mirror image rule applies. Then you must accept that offer as requested. If you have to stand on your head, if you have to deliver your acceptance in a singing telegram, so be it. Where it's not specified, the general rule basically is, if I can make it, break it down into its simplest form, is any reasonable means of acceptance. If your acceptance is reasonable under the circumstances, it should be fine. We were going to learn as well, another thing, an acceptance as a default rule is effective on dispatch, not upon receipt. And so if I make an offer to you in the mail, and you write a letter back to me accepting it, that's acceptable. That it matches most, if not all, of the primary terms. Then, when you put that mail, that letter, out of your possession at the post office, that is the acceptance. Even if that letter reaches me 4 days later, your acceptance is when you put it in the mail, not later. And that's a default rule. Don't forget that contracts law, as a general rule, follows the idea that people should be free to contract, and the relationship should be left alone as much as possible. The acceptance on dispatch, right, the offeree's dispatch, is only a default. If the offeror does not like that, the offeror can very easily specify that acceptance is only effective after I've received it, after I've opened it and read it, after I've looked at it and wrote you back saying, I see your offer, your acceptance, and I agree to it, so you can do it that way if you so choose. But the default is effective on dispatch, and that is affectionately known in contracts law circles as the Mailbox Rule, okay? Because it's developed in an era where primarily offers were made by and acceptances were sent by post. Let me recap briefly. Keep in mind, when you're talking about revoking an offer, or stated another way, terminating the offeree's power to accept an offer, there are several ways, which include spoken or communicated revocation, a lapse of time if stated, a lapse of time after a reasonable time if not stated, and remember that's the Loring case, death or incapacity of either party, the offeror or the offeree, and the last one was, as I recall, the actual rejection of the offer. I disagree, I can't do it, I don't want it, or a counteroffer. I like it, but I can't pay more than $5,000, not $6,000. When the $5,000 is locked in, done. That's a counteroffer rejection, and now the offeror, original offeror, has become the offeree who can accept the new bargain at $5,000. Thank you.